There is a specific, suffocating silence that descends upon a company of men the precise moment they realize they are entirely alone and about to die. It is March the 13th, 80-4, and on the sun-scorched scrubland of the eastern Sudan, that silence is deafening, broken only by the dry click of a breech block and the ragged breathing of terrified boys who should never have been sent to war. Before the smoke clears and the history books are written, we must understand the blood and the dust of the moment itself. If you believe, as we do, that the true history of the British Empire lies not in the gilded halls of Westminster, but in the grit of the common soldier, I invite you to subscribe to our channel as we uncover the forgotten chronicles of courage that shaped the modern world. The heat is a physical weight, pressing down at 100 degrees in the shade, though there is no shade to be found in this devil's garden of mimosa thorn and blinding white sand. Here, a solitary British detachment has become separated from the safety of the main column. They are 100 men isolated in a shallow depression of the earth, a topographical trap known locally as a khor. To the untrained eye of the young officer commanding them, the surrounding scrub looks empty, shimmering in the heat haze. But to the veteran, the very air tastes of ambush. Suddenly, the earth itself seems to rise up. From the concealing thorns, 2,000 warriors of the Hadendoa tribe, the famed and feared Fuzzy-Wuzzies, erupt into a charge. These are not a disorganized rabble. They are perhaps the finest light infantry the world has ever seen. Men who do not fear death, armed with heavy, double-edged swords capable of shearing through a pith helmet and the skull beneath it in a single blow. The roar is instantaneous and overwhelming, a primal scream that freezes the blood. In the center of the British formation, discipline, that iron backbone of the Victorian army, begins to fracture. These are not the hardened redcoats of Wellington's day. They are the products of the new short service system, mere boys from the slums of London and Manchester, barely 20 years old, clutching their Martini-Henry rifles with white-knuckled terror. They fire wildly, wasting precious ammunition on distant targets, filling the air with the acrid rotten egg stench of black powder smoke, blinding themselves to the onrushing horror. The line wavers. The square, that geometric symbol of British invincibility, is bending, buckling, ready to snap. At the center of this collapsing world stands Lieutenant Lord Alastair. He is 22 years old, the second son of an earl, resplendent in a uniform that still bears the creases of the tailor's press. He has attended Sandhurst. He has memorized the Queen's regulations. He knows the theoretical geometry of war. But he has never seen a man die. As the enemy closes to within 50 yards, the lieutenant freezes. His sword is drawn, but it hangs limp in his hand. His mouth opens to give a command to close ranks, to fix bayonets, to do something, anything, but no sound comes out. His mind has retreated into a fugue of sheer, paralyzing panic. He is watching his own death approach, and he is powerless to stop it. And then movement. Not from the officers nor the sergeants, but from the ranks. A figure steps forward, breaking the rigid formation. He is a private, technically the lowest form of life in the military hierarchy. But he does not move like a private. He moves with a terrible economy of purpose. He is a small man, his tunic ill-fitting, but his face is a map of conflict, deeply lined, tanned to the color of old leather, with a mustache waxed into stiff, aggressive points. This is Thomas Blackwood. And though his enlistment papers claim he is 38, the gray at his temples and the weary wisdom in his eyes betray a different truth. He is 60 years old. He marched up the heights of the Alma in the Crimea before the lieutenant was born. He stood in the sweeping rains of India during the mutiny. He has been retired, discharged, and forgotten by the country he served. Yet here he is, standing amidst a crumbling unit of terrified children. As the lieutenant stares into the abyss, paralyzed by the weight of his ancestors, Private Blackwood steps past him. He does not salute. He does not ask for permission. He simply shoves the officer aside with the rough indifference of a man clearing a piece of furniture. The old man raises his rifle, not with panic, but with the slow, fluid grace of a master craftsman picking up a tool. He looks at the breaking line of boys, his voice not a scream, but a low, gravelly growl that cuts through the din of battle like a foghorn. "Steady, lads," he says, cycling the lever of his rifle. "Look to me. The first man who runs, I'll shoot him myself." In that split second, the fate of the regiment hangs not on the orders of the aristocracy, but on the unauthorized courage of a man who should be bouncing grandchildren on his knee. The enemy is 20 yards away. The lieutenant is broken. The boys are on the verge of rout, but the old man has taken the field, and the lesson in survival is about to begin. To understand why a 60-year-old private was the only thing standing between a British regiment and total annihilation, We must first tear our eyes away from the blood-soaked sands of the Sudan and cast them back to the oak-paneled map rooms of Whitehall. The year is 1884, and to the casual observer, the British Empire appears as a titan, bestriding the globe in a colossus of pink territory. From the tea plantations of Ceylon to the frozen trap lines of the Hudson Bay, the Pax Britannica seems absolute. Yet, those with their ears to the ground, the old generals in their clubs on Pall Mall, and the grizzled sergeants in the mess halls knew a darker truth. The Titan was weary, the Titan was overstretched, and most dangerously of all, the Titan had forgotten how to fight. The world of the 8088s was a powder keg, and the fuse was burning dangerously close to the Empire's most vital artery, the Suez Canal. In the vast, inhospitable deserts of the Sudan, a religious storm had broken. A man named Muhammad Ahmad had declared himself the Mahdi, the expected one. This was not merely a tribal rebellion or a border skirmish, it was a holy war sweeping aside the corrupt Egyptian garrisons with the ferocity of a desert wind. The Mahdi's armies, the Ansar, known to the British soldier simply as the dervishes, were unlike any enemy the Queen's army had faced since the Sikh Wars. They were fearless, highly mobile, and driven by a spiritual conviction that made them indifferent to death. At the very heart of this catastrophe lay the besieged city of Khartoum, where General Charles Gordon Chinese Gordon, the Christian soldier, a hero of almost mythical status, was trapped, waiting for a relief column that moved with agonizing slowness. The eyes of the entire British public were fixed on Khartoum. The newspapers screamed for action. The music halls sang of Gordon's bravery. The government in London, led by the reluctant William Gladstone, dithered and delayed, paralyzed by the cost of intervention. But while the politicians debated, the desert burned. The Mahdist forces were not just threatening a city, they were threatening the stability of the entire region. If the Red Sea littoral fell, the route to India would be compromised, and the jewel in the crown would be cut off from the mother country. The stakes could not possibly have been higher. However, the tragedy that was unfolding in the scrubland outside Suakin was not merely a failure of political will. It was the result of a deliberate dismantling of the British Army's soul. To understand the fragility of the boys freezing under fire in that ravine, we must speak of the Cardwell Reforms. A decade prior, Edward Cardwell, the Secretary of State for War, had looked at the British Army, the Army of Wellington, the army that had held the line at Waterloo and crushed the Indian Mutiny, and decided it was too expensive. He abolished the purchase of commissions, which was well and good, but he also destroyed the long service system. For generations, a man enlisted for 21 years. The army was his father, his mother, and his home. These old sweats were hard drinking, hard swearing, and often illiterate, but they were masters of their trade. They could load and fire a musket in their sleep. They could march 30 miles in broken boots and still hold a bayonet steady when the cavalry charged. They were the men who had terrified Napoleon. Cardwell replaced them with short service, recruitsmen who signed up for 6 years with the colors and 6 with the reserve. The idea was to create a large pool of reservists, similar to the continental armies of Prussia and France. But the reality was catastrophic. The ranks were suddenly filled with malnourished teenagers from the industrial slums, boys who joined because they were starving, not because they were soldiers. They were physically smaller, prone to disease, and crucially, they lacked the hardened skepticism and grim endurance of the veterans. The backbone of the regiment, the private soldier with 15 years of experience who could steady the nerves of a frightened recruit with a single look, had been pensioned off. By 1884, the regiments serving in the Sudan were composed largely of these Cardwell soldiers. They were drilled on the parade square, certainly. They looked magnificent in reviews at Aldershot, marching in perfect time. But war is not a parade. When faced with the screaming fury of a Mahdist charge, drill books are useless without the steel of experience. These boys were being led by officers who were often just as green aristocrats who viewed war as a sporting extension of the fox hunt, convinced that the savage could never stand before the disciplined fire of the white man. They were tragically, lethally wrong. This was the new army, a paper tiger, untested and fragile. It was an army that had forgotten the harsh lessons of the past, the institutional memory of how to fight a savage war, how to form a rallying square in broken terrain, how to conserve ammunition, how to use the bayonet not as a prick but as a killing tool, had walked out the barrack gates when the old veterans were discharged. The government had saved money, yes, but they were about to pay the interest in blood, and so we find the Sukan field force hastily assembled and thrown into the furnace. It was a motley collection of units, pulled from garrison duty in Cairo and shipped down the Red Sea. They were ill-equipped for the desert. Their water bottles were made of wood that cracked in the heat. Their serge uniforms were heavy and suffocating, but their greatest deficiency was in their minds. They had been told stories of the Fuzzy-Wuzzie, how they hamstrung horses and disemboweled the wounded. Fear, corrosive and unseen, had permeated the ranks long before the first shot was fired. Into this volatile mixture steps our protagonist, Thomas Blackwood. He is an anachronism, a ghost from a bygone era. He represents the old army that Cardwell tried to erase. He remembers the Crimea, where the British soldiers stood in the freezing mud for months without complaint. He remembers the mutiny, where mercy was neither asked for nor given. He understands that in the chaos of battle, when the officers are dead or paralyzed and the smoke blinds you, the only thing that matters is the man standing next to you. The presence of a man like Blackwood in the ranks of a shiny new regiment was a deception, a lie told to a recruiting sergeant in a dim alehouse, but it was a necessary lie, because, as the political machinery of London ground on, and as the new army marched blindly into the trap set by a cunning and ruthless enemy, the Empire did not need another well-drilled boy who knew how to salute. It needed a man who knew how to kill. It needed the forgotten genius of the Victorian rancor. The world was ablaze. The Mahdi was rising. Khartoum was dying, and in a forgotten corner of the Sudan, a company of children led by a fool was walking into the slaughterhouse. The stage is set for a disaster that should have echoed through history as a massacre. That it did not is due entirely to the fact that one man refused to accept the New World Order and brought the ancient bloody wisdom of the past to bear on the present. If the private soldier of 1884 was a victim of the Cardwell Reforms, then his commander, Lieutenant Lord Alistair St. John, was its most dangerous byproduct. To look at him was to see the very image of imperial splendor. Tall, slender, with the high cheekbones of the aristocracy and a uniform that fit him like a second skin, he was the sort of young man who graced the recruitment posters in Trafalgar Square. He was 22 years old, the product of Eton and Sandhurst, and he possessed a confidence that was as absolute as it was unearned. Lord Alistair was not a coward. It is important to understand this, for to dismiss him as merely fearful would be to misunderstand the tragedy that was about to unfold. He was, in fact, desperately eager to prove himself. But his understanding of war had been formed in the lecture halls of the military academy and the manicured playing fields of England, where the rules were clear and the enemy played fair. He viewed the campaign in the Sudan not as a desperate struggle for survival against a fanatical enemy, but as a grand adventure, a chance to win a medal, mention his name in the dispatches, and return to his London club with a story to tell over brandy. He was a paper tiger on the regimental rolls. He was an officer and a gentleman, fully qualified to lead men into battle. In reality, he was a hollow vessel. He knew the precise angle at which a salute should be rendered. He could recite the regulations regarding the polishing of brass to the letter, but he lacked that essential, intangible quality the Victorians called bottom, the deep, gritty resolve that allows a man to think clearly when the air is thick with death. Worse, he possessed a fatal disdain for the advice of his inferiors. On the morning of the patrol, the warning signs were already present, had he chosen to see them. The color sergeant, a man named Hakeswill, a solid, dependable Enco who had spent his life in the trade, had approached the lieutenant with quiet urgency. Hakeswill had pointed out the density of the scrub, the core ravines that crisscrossed the map, and the reports from the scouts that the Hadendoa were moving in force. He suggested, with the respectful deferential tone required when a 40-year-old expert speaks to a 20-year-old novice, that the company should advance in close column, a tight formation that could quickly form a defensive square. Lord Alistair had laughed. It was a short, sharp bark of amusement that grated on the ears of the men nearby. He dismissed the sergeant's concerns as the nervous flutterings of an old woman. In the lieutenant's mind, the British army was invincible. The square was an archaic formation, a relic of the Napoleonic Wars. This was the modern age, the age of the Martini-Henry rifle, a weapon that could drop a man at 1,000 yards. Why bunch up and present a target? No, he ordered the men to advance in extended order, a loose, spread-out line designed to cover ground quickly. It was a formation suited for the open plains of Europe, not the claustrophobic, ambush-ready terrain of the Sudan. From the ranks, Private Thomas Blackwood watched this exchange with eyes that had seen too many young officers make too many bad decisions. He said nothing to speak out of turn was a court-martial offense, but his hands tightened on his rifle. He saw what the lieutenant could not, the nervous glances the boys were exchanging, the way they licked their dry lips, the trembling of their hands as they adjusted their kit. The men knew. Soldiers always know when their leader is incompetent. It is a primal instinct, a smell of fear that travels down the chain of command. They looked at Lord Alistair and saw not a leader, but a liability, and in the harsh calculus of war, a liability gets you killed. The tragedy of Lord Alistair was that he truly believed he was doing the right thing. He believed that Dash and Ellen were superior to caution. He pushed the pace, driving the men hard through the soft sand, ignoring the heat exhaustion that was already claiming stragglers. He was chasing glory. He wanted to be the first to spot the enemy, the first to engage. He was blind to the fact that he was marching his men away from the support of the main column, stretching the umbilical cord of safety until it snapped. As the company moved deeper into the scrub, the silence of the desert became oppressive. It was not a peaceful silence, it was a watching silence. The birds had stopped singing, the wind died down. The only sounds were the crunch of boots on gravel and the clink of metal canteens. A wiser man would have halted. A wiser man would have sensed the trap closing. But Lord Alistair rode his horse at the head of the line, his chin high, his eyes scanning the horizon for a flag or a formation, completely missing the thousands of eyes watching him from the grass at his feet. He was a man walking through a tiger's cage, convinced he was in a petting zoo. He treated the formidable Mahdist warriors as if they were unruly peasants who could be cowed by a sharp voice and a stiff upper lip. He did not understand that his enemy respected only strength, and they had measured him and found him wanting. The new army was about to meet the old war, and the collision would be catastrophic. Lord Alistair represents the hubris of an empire that had grown too comfortable, too assured of its own superiority. He is the embodiment of the system that prioritized social standing over competence and theory over practice. As the sun reached its zenith, turning the landscape into a shimmering furnace, the lieutenant finally halted the column. Not because he sensed danger, but because he wanted to consult his map, confident that the paper in his hands was more real than the ground beneath his feet. He did not know it, but he had just stopped his men in the exact center of the killing zone. The paper tiger was about to burn. While the lieutenant studied his map with the furrowed brow of the scholar, a few yards down the line, a man was studying the wind. To the casual observer, Private Thomas Blackwood was unremarkable, just another dusty soldier in a column of dusty men, leaning on his Martini-Henry rifle to take the weight off his feet. But if you looked closer, if you looked past the regulation pith helmet and the stained khaki tunic, you would see the anomalies. The way his hands, gnarled like the roots of an ancient oak, caressed the wood of his rifle stock with a familiarity that bordered on intimacy. The way he did not pant or gasp for air in the suffocating heat, but breathed in a slow, rhythmic cadence through the nose, conserving moisture, and the eyes. While the boys around him stared vacantly at the ground or whispered nervously to one another, Blackwood's eyes were in constant motion, scanning the scrub, the horizon, the ridgeline, dissecting the landscape for the slightest irregularity. Thomas Blackwood was a lie. His name on the regimental roll was a fabrication, or at least a half-truth. His age was listed as 38, a number that was already pushing the upper limit for an active serviceman. But under the layer of boot polish he had carefully applied to his hair and mustache in a dimly lit boarding house in Portsmouth 3 months ago, the roots were snow-white. He was 62 years old. He was a ghost, a revenant from a time when war was not a distant colonial adventure, but a meat grinder of European superpowers. He had taken the Queen's shilling in 1840, when the musket was still king and the army marched in scarlet coats that could be seen for miles. He had been a sergeant major in the 41st Foot, a man who had commanded respect with a raised eyebrow. Now he was a private, the lowest of the low, taking orders from boys who still had milk on their breath. Why was he here? Why leave the comfort of a Chelsea pensioner's bed or a quiet cottage to march into this hell? It was not for money. The pay was a pittance. It was not for glory. He had seen enough glory to know it was just a fancy word for blood. There was something far simpler and far more profound: duty. When the news of the disasters in the Sudan reached England, when the papers screamed that the empire was crumbling and the army was breaking, Blackwood had felt a pull in his gut that he could not ignore. He looked at the new army, with their short service and their lack of discipline, and he felt a cold dread. They were sending children to do a man's work. They needed steady hands. They needed the old sweats. And if the army wouldn't take him as he was, he would deceive them to save them. To understand the magnitude of the experience standing in that desert, you must understand where those gnarled hands had been. 30 years prior, on the slopes of the Alma in the Crimea, Blackwood had walked directly into the face of the Russian cannons. He had seen men torn apart by grape shot, the air thick with the iron hum of death. He had stood in the freezing mud of the trenches outside Sevastopol, wrapping his feet in rags to prevent frostbite, watching his friends die of cholera and dysentery, yet never breaking the line. He belonged to a generation of soldiers who were forged in iron. They did not rely on supply trains or comfortable barracks. They marched until they dropped, and then they crawled. He carried the map of these wars on his body. There was a jagged ridge of scar tissue on his left shoulder from a Russian bayonet, a divot in his thigh from a sepoy's musket ball during the Indian Mutiny, a conflict of such savage ferocity that it made the Sudan look like a skirmish. He lived with a constant dull ache in his joints, a reminder of nights spent sleeping in the monsoon rain. But pain, to a man like Blackwood, was simply information. It told him he was still alive. In this company of recruits, Blackwood was a silent guardian. He did not preach. He did not tell war stories. He knew that the young soldiers looked at him with a mixture of confusion and pity, an old duffer who didn't know when to quit. They didn't see him slip a pebble into his mouth to stimulate saliva and quench his thirst without drinking precious water. They didn't see him subtly adjusting the straps of the boy marching next to him to ease the burden on the lad's raw shoulders. They didn't realize that every time the column halted, Blackwood was checking his ammunition, wiping the dust from the breech of his rifle, ensuring the extractor was clean. While Lieutenant Lord Alastair worried about the perfect alignment of the ranks, Blackwood worried about the birds. He had noticed, 10 minutes ago, that a flock of sandgrouse had risen suddenly from a patch of mimosa to their left, squawking in alarm. Birds don't fly in the heat of the day unless something disturbs them. He had noticed the silence that followed the way the cicadas had ceased their chirping. To the old man, the desert was screaming a warning. He had tried to speak. Earlier, during a brief pause, he had caught the eye of Sergeant Hickswill. "Begging your pardon, Sergeant," Blackwood had rumbled, his voice low and textured like grinding stones. "But the ground here, it feels wrong, too much cover for him, and the birds are spooked." Hickswill, who was a good man but terrified of the lieutenant, had shaken his head. "Stow it, Blackwood. The officer has his orders. Keep your eyes front." So Blackwood had fallen silent. He knew the army. You obey. You follow the officer into the fire, even if he is marching you off a cliff. But he also prepared. He loosened the bayonet in its scabbard, checking that it would draw smooth and fast. He shifted his ammunition pouch to the front of his belt for easier access. He looked at the young private beside him, a lad named Jenkins, barely 18, with terror written in the sweat on his forehead. "Easy, son," Blackwood whispered, barely moving his lips. "Keep your thumb on the bolt. Don't look at the heat haze. Look for the movement in the grass." "I'm scared, Thomas," Jenkins had whispered back, his voice trembling. "Good," Blackwood replied, a grim smile touching the corners of his eyes. "Beer keeps you sharp. Just stay close to me. When it starts, you don't think. You just load and fire." "Understand," Jenkins nodded, drawing a measure of comfort from the granite solidity of the older man. He didn't know that he was standing next to a ghost of the Alma, a ghost who carried the collective memory of 1,000 battles. The forgotten genius of this story is not a general with a baton, but this singular, weathered private. He possessed no degree, he could barely write his own name, but he held AHD in survival. He knew the geometry of a killing field. He knew the psychology of a charge, and most importantly, he knew that the moment was coming, the moment when the shouting would start, and the thin veneer of civilization would be stripped away, leaving only the man and the beast. As the column resumed its march, trudging deeper into the ravine, Blackwood shifted his grip on the Martini-Henry. He felt the familiar weight of the weapon, a comforting anchor in a world of uncertainty. He was ready. He had been ready for 40 years. The lieutenant might have the rank, but when the first spear flew from the darkness, the regiment would belong to the man who knew how to fight. The ghost of the Alma was about to manifest, and for the boys of the Sukan Field Force, he would be the only salvation they had. They called it the Devil's Garden, and there has rarely been a topographical designation in military history that was quite so apt. To the uninitiated eye, the scrubland around Tamai appeared to be nothing more than a flat, monotonous expanse of gray-green bush. But to the soldier trying to march through it, it was a torture chamber designed by nature itself. The ground was not solid. It was a shifting ocean of fine, powdery dust that swallowed boots up to the ankle, turning every step into a test of will. And then there were the thorns. The mimosa bushes were armed with hooked barbs, known ironically by the troops as wait-a-bits, because once they snagged your tunic or your flesh, you had no choice but to stop and untangle yourself. It is into this suffocating labyrinth that Lieutenant Lord Alastair drove his company. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the sun had ceased to be a celestial body and had become a physical weapon, hammering down with a ferocity that blurred the vision and swelled the tongue. The heat in the nullahs, the dry riverbeds, reached temperatures that could bake bread. And it was here that the insidious friction of war began to take its toll. Friction is the term military theorists use to describe the accumulation of small, seemingly minor difficulties that degrade a unit's performance. A strap breaks, a water bottle leaks, a man stumbles. In the Devil's Garden, friction was absolute. The men were exhausted. They had been awake since before dawn, fueled only by hardtack biscuits and lukewarm tea. Now, their canteens were nearly empty, the water within them hot and tasting of wood and rot. The short-service boys, unacclimatized and physically slight, began to flag. Their faces were masks of dust, their eyes rimmed with red, sweat soaking through their heavy serge tunics, turning the fabric into a suffocating embrace. Yet the lieutenant pressed on, driven by his desire to locate the enemy and prove the mettle of his command. He ignored the golden rule of desert warfare: never separate yourself from your water supply. The main British column, a massive square of 4,000 men moving with the slow, ponderous safety of a fortress, was now a mile behind them. The dust cloud that marked its position was fading into the shimmering haze. The umbilical cord was cut. The company was now a tiny, isolated organism floating in a sea of hostility. Close up, damn you!" Lord Alistair's voice cracked with impatience as he rode back and forth along the ragged line. His horse, a fine chestnut mare, danced nervously, spooked by the smell of the scrub. "You're marching like a gaggle of milkmaids. Pick up the pace." He did not see the men stumbling. He did not see Private Jenkins vomit into the sand, wiped clean by Blackwood, and shoved back into line. He saw only his map and the empty horizon. He was chasing a phantom. He believed the Mahdists were retreating, running scared before the might of the Queen. He was pushing his men to catch a fleeing enemy, unaware that he was sprinting headlong into the jaws of a predator that was waiting perfectly still. Private Blackwood marched on the right flank, his eyes narrowed to slits against the glare. He felt the isolation in his bones. He knew with the instinct of a man who had survived the hunting grounds of India that they had gone too far. The terrain was changing. They were descending into a wide, shallow depression, a core, where the scrub grew taller, thicker, and more malevolent. The visibility, which had been bad, dropped to 20 yards. It was claustrophobic. The bush pressed in on all sides, a wall of thorns that could hide an army. It was the silence that terrified him most. In the last mile, the desert had gone mute. No insects buzzed, no kites circled overhead. It was a vacuum of sound, the kind of heavy, pregnant stillness that precedes a thunderstorm. Blackwood shifted his rifle, his thumb brushing the brass of the breech block. He slowed his pace slightly, allowing the gap between him and the man in front to widen, giving himself room to traverse his weapon. "Sergeant," Blackwood hissed, risking the wrath of the Nenko. "The flanks. We're blind on the flanks." Sergeant Hicksville looked at him, his face a mask of exhaustion and worry. He opened his mouth to rebuke the private, but stopped. He looked at the thick wall of mimosa to their right. He saw the way the shadows seemed to pool in the depths of the ravine. The sergeant knew it too. The primal alarm bells were ringing. "I know, Blackwood," Hicksville whispered back, gripping his own rifle tighter. "I know, but he won't stop. He's got the bit between his teeth." The lieutenant, sensing the slowing pace, wheeled his horse around. "Sergeant Hicksville, why is this line lagging? Get these men moving. We have ground to cover." "Sir," Hicksville shouted, snapping to attention, the habit of obedience overriding the instinct of survival. "Pick it up, lads. Look lively." And so they marched into the trap. The ravine widened, the sides rising up slightly, forming a natural amphitheater. The ground here was broken, littered with large rocks and clumps of dry grass, perfect cover for a skirmisher. The company was now fully committed. To retreat would take 20 minutes of hard marching back up the slope. To advance was to walk deeper into the funnel. Blackwood felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It was a physical sensation, a prickling of the skin that he hadn't felt since the trenches of Sevastopol. He smelled it then, not the dust or the sweat or the horse manure. He smelled rancid butter. It was the substance the Hadendowa warriors used to dress their great mops of hair. It was a faint, musky scent carried on a sudden shift of the wind. He stopped. He didn't care about the orders anymore. He stopped dead in his tracks, bringing his rifle up to the port arms position. "Boy," he said to Jenkins, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Load." "What?" Jenkins stammered, nearly colliding with him. "Load your weapon, lad. Now, up ahead." The lieutenant halted his horse. He had seen something. A movement in the grass? A flash of metal? Or perhaps finally the silence had penetrated his arrogance. The company ground to a halt, the sound of boots ceasing, leaving them suspended in the terrible, quiet heat. 100 men, breathing hard, standing in a bowl of dust. From the ridgeline to their left, a single rock clattered down the slope. It sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. Every head turned. The lieutenant stared at the bush, his mouth slightly open, and then the Devil's Garden bloomed. It began not with a command, but with a seismic shift in the landscape itself. From behind every scrub bush, every boulder, and every dip in the ground, the Hadendoa rose. They were not dozens, as the lieutenant had arrogantly assumed, but thousands. They stood for a fraction of a second, a vast, dark frieze against the blinding sun, their hair frizzed into great halos, their bodies clad in the patched jibba tunics of the Mahdist. And then they moved. The sound hit the British line before the men did. It was a roar, a collective, guttural scream of Allah that rolled down the slopes like a physical wave, slamming into the chests of the young recruits with the force of a blow. It was the sound of absolute fanatical certainty meeting the fragile silence of doubt. And in the face of that roar, the veneer of the new army evaporated instantly. To the terrified boys of the Suakin field force, the charge did not look like men running. It looked like a force of nature. The Mahdist warriors covered the ground with terrifying speed, bounding over the rough terrain with the agility of leopards. They did not fire muskets, they carried heavy, double-edged broadswords and stabbing spears. They were closing the distance 200 yards, 150, 100 intent on only one thing, to look their enemy in the eye and hack him apart. "Fire!" The scream came from Sergeant Hakeswill, his voice cracking with desperation. "For God's sake, fire!" the British line erupted, but it was not the rolling, rhythmic thunder of a disciplined volley. It was a ragged, panic spasm of noise. The recruits, their hands trembling so violently they could barely hold their weapons, jerked their triggers. 100 Martini-Henry rifles discharged, sending a massive cloud of white, sulphurous smoke billowing into the stagnant air. But the bullets went high. In their terror, the boys had failed to adjust their sights. They were firing at the horizon, at the sky, at the ghosts in their minds. The heavy, all 4.5 caliber rounds, capable of stopping a charging horse, whistled harmlessly over the heads of the onrushing warriors. The smoke was the final betrayal. In the windless ravine, the black powder discharge hung thick and heavy, creating an impenetrable gray curtain directly in front of the British line. The soldiers were now blind. They could not see the enemy, but they could hear them. The drumming of feet on the hard earth grew louder, faster, a frantic staccato rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the pounding of their own hearts. They fumbled with their levers, their fingers slick with sweat, trying to eject the spent casings. Panic. A boy dropped his cartridge in the sand. Another froze, staring blankly into the smoke, his mind shutting down in the face of sensory overload. In the center of this swirling bedlam sat Lieutenant Lord Alastair St. John. His horse, maddened by the noise and the smell of bloodlust, reared and plunged, fighting the bit. The lieutenant sat in the saddle like a man carved from ice. His face was drained of all color, a porcelain mask of shock. The map he had been studying fluttered from his hand and was trampled into the dust. This was the moment he had been trained for. This was the moment the officer draws his sword, steadies the ranks, and becomes the anchor of the soul. But Lord Alastair was gone. His mind, unable to process the catastrophe his arrogance had engineered, had retreated into a dark, silent room. He watched the scene unfolding around him not as a participant, but as a spectator at a play that had gone horribly, violently wrong. He saw the smoke, he saw the shapes emerging from it, he saw the terror on the faces of his men, but he could not speak. The orders died in his throat, strangled by the realization of his own mortality. Then, the contact. The Hadendoa hit the British line with the impact of a freight train. They burst through the smoke, emerging as nightmares made flesh, swinging their great swords with devastating power. The extended order formation so beloved by the lieutenant proved fatal. The gaps between the soldiers were too wide. The enemy poured through them like water through a broken dam surrounding the individual soldiers, isolating them in pockets of desperate, lonely violence. The sound of the battle changed instantly from the crack of rifles to the sickening wet thud of steel on meat. It was intimate, brutal work. A British private, barely 18, tried to parry a sword blow with his bayonet, but the force of the strike shattered his rifle stock and clove into his shoulder. Another was speared through the chest before he could even raise his weapon. The screams of the dying mingled with the triumphant ululations of the killers. The air turned pink with mist. Sergeant Hakeswill, the one man who might have held the center, died trying to do the lieutenant's job. He had drawn his revolver, shooting a warrior at point-blank range, shouting for the men to close up, to form a knot, to stand back to back. On me, you bastards! Stand fast!" But he was alone. A spear took him in the side, driving him to his knees. As he looked up, gasping for air, a sword stroke ended his war. The anchor was gone. The disintegration was rapid and total. The psychological fabric of the unit tore apart. Men threw down their rifles, the Queen's property, their only means of survival, and turned to run. But there was nowhere to run. The ravine was a bowl, and the rim was lined with spearmen. They were rats in a barrel. The instinct to flee the rout is the most dangerous moment in warfare. When a soldier turns his back, he ceases to be a combatant and becomes prey. The slaughter intensified. The Hadendoa, seeing the British backs, surged forward with renewed fury. The scene was a tableau of chaos. Dust, smoke, blood, and the frenzied motion of killing. The new army, with its precise drills and smart uniforms, was being dismantled piece by piece. The officers were silent or dead. The encos were overwhelmed. The privates were fleeing into the waiting arms of death. It was not a battle anymore, it was an execution. In the midst of this swirling vortex of destruction, the lieutenant remained atop his horse, a singular tragic figure rising above the carnage. A warrior slashed at the horse's flank, and the beast screamed, finally throwing its rider. Lord Alistair hit the ground hard, the breath driven from his lungs. He scrambled backward on his hands and knees, his pristine uniform now caked in bloody mud, his eyes wide with the comprehension of a child waking from a nightmare. He looked around for help, for a sergeant, for anyone to tell him what to do. But there was no one, just the swirling smoke and the shadows of men dying because he had led them there. He curled into a ball, covering his head with his arms, waiting for the end. The unit was broken. The formation was gone. In military terms, they were combat ineffective. In human terms, they were dead men walking. The Mahdists were closing the circle, tightening the noose, preparing to wipe the Suakin Field Forces C Company from the pages of history. There was no hope, no reinforcements, no leadership. But in the periphery of the slaughter, amidst the screaming and the running, one microscopic point of stability remained. One man had not fired blindly into the smoke. One man had not thrown down his rifle. One man had watched the sergeant fall and the lieutenant crumble, and had accepted the grim reality that the chain of command had just been severed. The new army had died in the dust of the ravine. The time for drill was over. The time for the old way had arrived. And as the shadow of a swordsman fell over the cowering lieutenant, a bayonet, dull, heavy, and triangular, suddenly interposed itself between the aristocrat and the executioner. Time is a deceptive mistress in war. There is the time of the clock, the precise, mechanical ticking that governs the movements of trains and the changing of the guard. And then there is combat time. In the adrenaline-flooded brain of a soldier fighting for his life, a single second can stretch into an agonizing hour, allowing him to see the rotation of a bullet in flight or the specific pattern of dust rising from a falling body. Conversely, hours can vanish in a blur of noise and recoil. For the trapped men of C Company, huddled back-to-back in the blistering heat of the Tamai scrub, the next 40 minutes would not be measured in ticks of the clock, but in heartbeats and spent cartridges. It would be a 40-minute eternity. The rallying knot that Blackwood had forged was ugly. It possessed none of the geometric perfection of the parade ground squares Lord Alistair had studied at Sandhurst. It was a jagged, breathing organism of dirty khaki, bristling with bayonets, swaying slightly as men jostled for footing among the rocks. But it was alive, and under the guidance of the 60-year-old private, it was beginning to function with the ruthless efficiency of a machine. Blackwood knew that panic is a fire that consumes ammunition. A terrified boy will empty his magazine at a shadow, at a rustle in the grass, at nothing, and when the pouches are empty, the massacre begins. To survive, he had to control the rate of fire. He had to impose his will not just on the enemy but on the trigger fingers of his own men. "Hold!" Blackwood's voice was a rhythmic chant, pacing the interior of the circle like a caged tiger. "Hold your fire, watch the front, wait for the order." The Hadendoa, realizing that the easy slaughter was over, changed their tactics. They stopped the mass charges and began to probe. They used the scrub crawling on their bellies, creeping closer, popping up to fire a snapshot or hurl a spear before vanishing again. It was a game of nerves. The boys wanted to shoot back, to lash out at the tormentors, but Blackwood held them in check. "Steady, Jenkins. Not yet. Let him come." He was resurrecting a tactic that had died out with the introduction of the breech-loader, volley fire. In the age of rapid-fire rifles, it was considered obsolete, but Blackwood knew that the volley had a psychological weight that independent fire lacked. The crash of 50 rifles firing simultaneously is the voice of a giant. It tells the enemy that the unit is not a collection of individuals, but a single, disciplined entity. Front rank present, the rifles came up. The boys looked down the sights, their eyes stinging with sweat. Fire, the crash was physically stunning. A wall of lead swept the scrub. The probing warriors were cut down instantly. Reload. This was the rhythm of the eternity. Present. Fire. Reload. Blackwood was the conductor of this orchestra of death. He moved constantly, ignoring the bullets that zipped past him like angry hornets. He knew that if he stopped moving, the boys would look at the hopeless odds and break, so he became a performance. He walked with a deliberate, exaggerated slowness, a swagger that said, "I am not afraid, so why should you be?" He used the old army humor, grim, dark, and utterly stabilizing. When a spear landed in the center of the square, quivering in the earth inches from a young private's boot, Blackwood laughed, a dry, rasping chuckle. "Nice throw," he muttered, loud enough for the men to hear. But he missed the coconut. No cigar for him. "Keep firing, lads." The weapon of the day, the Martini-Henry, was a magnificent tool of destruction, but it was a cruel master. It fired a massive 4.500 Fabulot, but the recoil was punishment. Every time a boy pulled the trigger, the rifle kicked back with 40 pounds of force. After 10 rounds, shoulders were bruising. After 20, they were numb, and then there was the heat. The black powder cartridges burned dirty and hot. The barrels of the rifles grew scorching to the touch, blistering the fingers of the men. The burning residue fouled the breeches, making the extractor lever stick. Here, Blackwood's experience was vital. He saw a man struggling to open his breech, hammering at the lever in panic. Blackwood was there in an instant. "Don't force it, son, you'll snap the extractor." He grabbed the rifle, used the heel of his hand to slap the lever open, ejecting the stuck casing. "Blow down the barrel. Clear the grit. That's it. Keep it wet." In the center of the square, Lieutenant Lord Alastair watched. He had recovered his pistol, but he had not fired a shot. He was witnessing a revelation that shattered his entire worldview. He had been raised to believe that leadership was a birthright, conferred by blood and title. He believed that the officer was the brain and the soldier merely the muscle. Yet here, in the crucible of reality, the hierarchy was inverted. He was the child, helpless and trembling, and the peasant, the man who scrubbed floors and polished boots, was the king. Lord Alastair watched Blackwood with a mixture of shame and adoration. He saw the way the old man touched the soldiers, a grip on the shoulder, a slap on the back, physical contact that grounded them in reality. He saw the way Blackwood anticipated the enemy's moves, shifting men to plug gaps before they even opened. It was not textbook warfare, it was an art form. It was the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 years of British infantry fighting, distilled into one gray-haired man. The physical toll of the 40-minute eternity was horrific. The thirst became a torture. The men had been out of water for hours. Their tongues swelled in their mouths, their lips cracked and bled. The smoke from the black powder mixed with the dust and sweat to coat their faces in a thick black grime, leaving only the whites of their eyes and the pink of their gums visible. They looked like demons. The noise was unrelenting. The crack thump of the martinis, the zipping of enemy bullets, the chanting of the dervishes, "Allah, Allah," and the screams of the wounded. It was a sensory overload that threatened to shatter the mind. Yet, under the hypnotic rhythm of Blackwood's commands, load, present, fire, the boys entered a trance state. They ceased to be individuals with fears and hopes. They became components of the square. They forgot about home, about their mothers, about death. They focused only on the breech block, the cartridge, the sight, the trigger. Blackwood, too, was feeling the strain. His old wound from the Crimea was throbbing with a dull, sickening ache. His lungs were burning from the smoke. He knew with the cold calculation of a veteran that this could not last. He was counting the rounds. He watched men reaching into their pouches, their fingers scrabbling deeper and deeper for cartridges. The heavy leather pouches, once full, were becoming terrifyingly light. They had held the ground. They had punished the enemy. But a defensive battle in the desert has only one outcome if relief does not arrive: attrition. The Hadendoa had thousands of men. Blackwood had 80 left standing. Time was on the enemy's side. As the sun began to dip, casting long, bloody shadows across the ravine, the attacks intensified. The dervishes sensed the slowing rate of fire. They crept closer, emboldened. A warrior managed to crawl within 10 yards and hurled a throwing stick that struck a corporal in the face. The man went down screaming. The square wavered. Blackwood stepped over the fallen corporal, firing from the hip, dropping the attacker. He looked around the circle. The faces looking back at him were gaunt, blackened masks of exhaustion. They had given everything. They had held the line because he told them to. He checked his own pouch. 5 rounds. He looked at Lord Alastair. The lieutenant met his gaze. There was no arrogance left in the young aristocrat's eyes. Only a silent question: what now? Blackwood knew the answer. To stay here was to die. To retreat was to be cut down. There was only one option left. It was the most dangerous, the most old army option of them all. It was the tactic that had won the empire, from the fields of Blenheim to the hills of Zululand. He spat a glob of black saliva into the dust. He jacked a fresh round into the chamber of his Martini-Henry. He looked at the boys, his voice dropping to a low, feral growl. "Right then," he said, "we're out of brass, and I'm getting bored of this spot." He reached to his belt and unclipped the long, triangular bayonet. He slotted it onto the muzzle of his rifle with a metallic snick that sounded louder than a cannon shot. "Fix bayonets!" The order rippled through the exhausted men. There was a moment of hesitation, a collective intake of breath. To shoot an enemy is one thing, to skewer him is another. It requires a different kind of courage. But then, slowly, one by one, the bayonets came out. Snick, snick, snick. A forest of steel grew from the huddled knot. Blackwood turned to face the thickest concentration of the enemy, the route back to the main column. He didn't look like a 60-year-old recruit anymore. He looked like the angel of death. "We're not dying in a hole," Blackwood announced, his voice steady as granite. "We are going home, and we are going through them." There is a peculiar psychology attached to the bayonet. In the age of the machine gun and the breech-loading rifle, military theorists had already begun to dismiss it as an anachronism, a relic of a time when men stood in lines and poked at one another with pikes. But to the British soldier of the Victorian era, the bayonet was not merely a weapon, it was a talisman, it was the ultimate expression of will. To shoot a man from a distance requires a steady eye, but to drive 18 inches of triangular steel into his chest requires a savagery that transcends training. It is an act of supreme intimacy. And for the enemy, even an enemy as fearless as the Hadendoa, there is a primal, reptilian terror in seeing a wall of men abandon the safety of distance and rush forward with the intent to impale. Private Thomas Blackwood understood this. He knew that the ammunition was gone. He knew that their throats were too dry to shout. He knew that their legs were trembling with the lactic acid of exhaustion. But he also knew that momentum is a force that can override the body's desire to quit. If they stayed in the ravine, they would die as victims. If they charged, they might still die, but they would die as soldiers. "Listen to me," Blackwood hissed, his voice sounding like gravel grinding in a cement mixer. "We don't run. We don't stop. We move as one, a solid wall. If a man goes down, you step over him. If you go down, you use your teeth. We are going to the high ground. Do you understand?" The boys nodded. Their eyes were wide, fixed on the gray-haired man who had become their universe. Private Jenkins, the boy who had vomited in the sand hours ago, wiped his mouth with a sleeve that was stiff with dried blood. He gripped his rifle until his knuckles turned white. He looked at the bayonet fixed to the end of the barrel. It looked terrifyingly long. It looked like salvation. "Shoulder to shoulder," Blackwood commanded. "Make yourself big." The knot of men loosened slightly, expanding into a crude wedge formation. Blackwood took the point. It was suicide, of course. To lead a charge is to invite every spear and sword to target you first. But the old man didn't care. He was already living on borrowed time. He had survived the Alma. He had survived the mutiny. This was just one more dance. He looked at Lieutenant Lord Alastair. The officer was standing on the flank of the wedge, his revolver held in a shaking hand. But his head was up. "Ready, sir?" Blackwood asked, a faint, grim smile touching his lips. "Ready, Blackwood," the lieutenant whispered, and for the first time in his life he meant it. "Right." Blackwood took a deep breath, drawing in the hot, copper-scented air of the battlefield. He raised his rifle high above his head, the bayonet catching the dying light of the sun. "Charge!" It was not the glorious, trumpet-blaring charge of the Light Brigade. It was a guttural, desperate roar of 80 men who had decided that they would rather kill than die. They surged forward, their boots kicking up clouds of dust. The scream that tore from their throats was not a cheer. It was a release of terror, a sound that purged the fear from their bodies and replaced it with a cold, white, hot aggression. The Hadendoa were taken completely by surprise. They had expected the British to cower in their circle until the end. They had expected to pick them off one by one. They did not expect the prey to bare its teeth. The sudden sight of the redcoats, now gray with dust rushing towards them with leveled steel, caused a ripple of hesitation in the Mahdist ranks, and in close-quarters combat, hesitation is death. Blackwood hit the enemy line like a battering ram. A warrior stepped forward to meet him, swinging a heavy sword. Blackwood didn't parry. He stepped inside the swing, using the length of the rifle to drive the bayonet upwards, under the man's guard. The impact was jarring, a shock that ran up his arms to his shoulders. He didn't stop to admire his handiwork. He twisted the weapon, freed the blade, and butt-stroked the next man in the face with a force that shattered bone. "Keep moving! Keep moving!" he roared, wading through the press of bodies. Behind him, the recruits were fighting with the frenzy of the possessed. Private Jenkins, the boy who had been afraid of the silence, was now screaming like a banshee, thrusting his bayonet with a piston-like fury. He saw a warrior lunge at his friend Smithers. Jenkins didn't think, he simply acted, driving his steel into the attacker's side. The new army training, so often criticized, had given them the muscle memory of the lunge and parry, but it was Blackwood's spirit that gave them the ferocity to use it. The The melee was a blur of chaotic violence. There was no time for tactics. It was a brawl. It was knees and elbows, rifle butts and boots. The air was filled with the sounds of the slaughterhouse, the grunt of exertion, the snap of breaking wood, the wet tearing of cloth and flesh. It was unglamorous, ugly, and horrifyingly intimate. You could smell the sweat of the man you were killing. You could see the whites of his eyes as the light faded from them. In the center of the wedge, Lieutenant Lord Alistair found his redemption. A dervish swordsman had broken through the line and was raising his blade to strike a wounded corporal. The lieutenant, his pistol empty, did not freeze this time. He threw the revolver at the man's face, a distraction that bought a fraction of a second, and then tackled the warrior. They rolled in the dust, a tangle of limbs in desperation. The aristocrat, who had never fought anything more dangerous than a playful wrestling match at school, found a rock and brought it down on the man's head. He scrambled up, gasping, covered in dust and blood that was not his own. He was no longer a lord. He was just another soldier in the dirt. "On the flank! Watch the flank!" Blackwood's voice cut through the din. They were cutting a path through the enemy, a corridor of violence. The shock action of the charge had shattered the immediate ring of besiegers, but more were coming. The Hadendoa were swarming on the sides, trying to drag the men down, to break the momentum. "Don't stop!" Blackwood bellowed, using his rifle like a quarterstaff to sweep a warrior off his feet. "If you stop, you die! Push! Push!" They were climbing now. They were fighting their way up the slope of the ravine, out of the Devil's Garden, and towards the open ground. Every step was a battle against gravity and the enemy. Men fell. A private went down, clutching a spear in his leg. Two of his comrades grabbed him by the webbing and dragged him. No one was left behind. The old way demanded it. And then, suddenly, the pressure eased. The scrub thinned. The claustrophobic walls of the ravine fell away. They crested the ridge. Ahead of them, a mile away, stood the main British squares. Massive, immovable blocks of men, red coats distinct against the sand, wreathed in the smoke of artillery. They looked like castles. They looked like heaven. "There!" Blackwood shouted, pointing with his bloody bayonet. "There's the flag! Run, you bastards! Run!" The Hadendoa, seeing their prey escaping to the safety of the heavy guns, made one last desperate attempt to close the gap. A group of 50 warriors sprinted to cut them off, but the British had the scent of survival in their nostrils now. They were unstoppable. They ran with a clumsy, stumbling gait, their chests heaving, their mouths open in silent screams for air. As they closed the distance to the main square, the artillery crews of the Royal Artillery spotted the ragtag group emerging from the smoke. "Hold fire!" an officer shouted. "It's our own!" The guns fell silent. The wall of the great square opened, a gate of disciplined men stepping aside to let the survivors in. They stumbled through the gap, collapsing onto the sand as soon as they were inside the perimeter. They were safe. The iron square closed behind them, a wall of rifles snapping shut. The silence that followed was shocking. After the roar of the charge and the screams of the melee, the interior of the square felt like a cathedral. The survivors of C Company lay in a heap, gasping, retching, crying. They were covered in gore, their uniforms shredded, their faces black with powder and caked with mud. They looked less like soldiers and more like devils dredged up from the underworld. Lieutenant Lord Alistair sat on the ground, his head between his knees, shaking uncontrollably. The adrenaline dump was hitting him, a physical crash that left him weak as a kitten. He looked at his hands. They were raw, bruised, and stained. He looked at the men around him, the scum of the earth he had so disdained. He saw Jenkins holding a water bottle to the lips of a wounded friend. He saw the shared looks of men who have walked through the fire together. And then he saw Blackwood. The old man was standing a little way off, leaning on his rifle. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving like a bellows. There was a cut on his forehead, bleeding freely, turning the shoe polish in his hair into a sticky, dark mask. He looked incredibly old. The energy that had sustained him, the spirit of the bayonet, was draining away, leaving behind a frail, exhausted body. He slowly, methodically unclipped his bayonet. He took a rag from his pocket and wiped the blade clean before sliding it back into its scabbard. He checked the breech of his rifle. He adjusted his tunic. Even now, on the verge of collapse, the discipline held. A colonel from the main column rode up, looking down at the devastation of the survivors with a mixture of horror and respect. He spotted the lieutenant. "Good God, man," the colonel said, his voice hushed. His voice, "We thought you were all dead. How did you get out? Who organized the retreat?" Lord Alistair looked up. He looked at the colonel, immaculate in his uniform. Then he looked at Blackwood. The private was standing at attention, staring straight ahead, his face a mask of impassive granite. He would never claim the credit. It wasn't his place. He was just a ranker. The lieutenant swallowed. He stood up, his legs shaky but holding. He walked over to Blackwood. He didn't say a word. He simply stood in front of the private and, in full view of the colonel and the entire brigade, he saluted. It was a breach of protocol. Officers do not salute privates. But Lord Alastair held the salute, his hand trembling slightly at the brim of his helmet. "It wasn't me, sir," the lieutenant said, his voice cracking with emotion as he turned to the colonel. "It was this man, Private Blackwood. He saved the regiment." Blackwood's eyes flickered for a moment. He looked at the young officer, the boy who had been a paper tiger, now forged into something real. A ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth beneath the waxed mustache. "Just doing my duty, sir," Blackwood rumbled, his voice barely a whisper. "Just doing my duty." The massacre had been averted, but the cost was written on the faces of every man lying in the sand. They had gone into the ravine as boys and paper soldiers. They had come out as veterans, baptized in the Church of the Bayonet, led by a high priest who should have been tending a garden in Chelsea. The sun sets quickly in the Sudan. One moment, the desert is a blinding anvil of white heat. The next, it is plunged into a bruised purple twilight, and the temperature plummets with shocking speed. On the night of March 13, 1884, the British camp at Sukin was a place of ghosts. The roar of the Martini-Henrys and the screams of the charge had been replaced by the low, piteous moans of the wounded in the field hospital and the scratching of pens on paper in the command tents. War, in its immediate aftermath, ceases to be a matter of courage and becomes a matter of accounting. The Empire demands to know the cost of doing business. In the command tent, illuminated by the guttering light of an oil lamp, Lieutenant Lord Alastair St. John sat before a field desk. He was unrecognizable as the pristine aristocrat who had marched out that morning. His uniform was torn, stained with the brown of dried blood and the black of powder residue. His hand, holding the pen, shook with a fine, rhythmic tremor that he could not suppress. Across from him sat the colonel, a man of the old school, with mutton chop whiskers and eyes that had seen the cost of empire from the Cape to Kabul. He was reading the lieutenant's draft report. The silence in the tent was heavy, broken only by the distant braying of a mule. "This report, St. John," the colonel said finally, placing the paper on the desk with a heavy hand. "It is highly irregular." "It is the truth, sir," Alastair replied, his voice raspy from smoke and thirst. "You state here," the colonel tapped the paper with a manicured finger, "that during the engagement in the Corps, command was effectively assumed by a private soldier, a Private Blackwood. You claim he organized the defense, directed the volley fire, and led the countercharge. He did, sir. If not, for him, C Company would be lying dead in that ravine. Every man Jacobus." The colonel sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He looked at the young lieutenant with a mixture of pity and stern paternalism. "I do not doubt your word, Alastair. I saw the men come in. I saw how they looked at him. But you must understand the position of the service. We cannot send a dispatch to the Horse Guard stating that a 60-year-old pensioner had to step in because a commissioned officer—" He trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the smoky air. "It would not do. It would undermine the very fabric of discipline. The men must believe in their officers. The public must believe in the system." "So we lie?" Alastair asked, a flash of his newfound steel appearing in his eyes. "We sanitize," the colonel corrected gently. "We write that you rallied the men, that you led the charge, supported ably by the encos and the rank and file. We will mention Blackwood. We will recommend him for a Distinguished Conduct Medal, but we cannot make him the hero of the day. The army runs on hierarchy, my boy. If we admit that a private knows more than a lieutenant, the whole thing tumbles down, and so the ink flowed, and history was rewritten in the moment of its making. The official dispatch from Suakin praised the steadiness of the troops and the gallant leadership of the officers. Private Thomas Blackwood's tactical genius, his mastery of the psychological pivot point of battle, was reduced to a single line. Private T. Blackwood showed great spirit in the melee. While the officers debated the narrative, the subject of their consternation was sitting on a crate outside the medical tent. The regimental surgeon, a weary man with a butcher's apron, was tending to the gash on Blackwood's forehead. As the surgeon wiped away the dried blood with a sponge soaked in iodine, he paused. He frowned, scrubbing harder at Blackwood's hairline. The black shoe polish, compromised by the sweat of the furnace and the blood of the wound, was wiping away, revealing the stark, snowy white roots beneath. The surgeon pulled back, looking at the man properly for the first time. He saw the map of wrinkles around the eyes, the loose skin on the neck, the scars on the shoulder that dated back to muskets, not rifles. "Good God, man," the surgeon whispered. "How old are you?" Blackwood didn't flinch. He lit a pipe, the match flaring to illuminate his tired granite face. "Old enough to know better, sir. Young enough to do the job." "You're a fraud," the surgeon said, though there was no malice in his voice, only wonder. You shouldn't be here. You should be in a rocking chair. If the exertion didn't kill you, your heart should have exploded." "My heart's fine, sir." Blackwood exhaled a cloud of blue smoke. "It's the feet that give me jip. The secret was out. There would be no court-martial. It would be too embarrassing for the regiment to admit they had been duped by a senior citizen, but there would be no further service. The Cardwell system could not tolerate an anomaly like Blackwood. He was a glitch in the machine, a reminder of a past the army was desperately trying to modernize away. By the next morning, the paperwork was already drawn up. Services no longer required. Medical discharge on grounds of Constitution. The following dawn, the column prepared to move out, to continue the grind towards Tamai. But one man was not marching. Thomas Blackwood stood by the supply wagons, his kit bag at his feet. He was in civilian clothes, a rough tunic and trousers provided by the quartermaster. He looked smaller without the uniform. The armor of the soldier had been stripped away, leaving just an old man in the desert. Lieutenant Lord Alastair found him there. The officer walked over, limping slightly from the bruising of the fight. The dynamic between them had shifted irrevocably. There was no rank here, just two men who had seen the elephant. "They're sending you back," Alastair said. "It wasn't a question." "Aye, sir. Back to Chelsea. They reckon I'm a liability." Blackwood smiled, the expression crinkling his eyes. "You saved us," Alastair said, his voice thick with emotion. "I wanted you to know. I know what you did. The men know. I tried to put it in the report, but—" "Don't worry about the report, sir," Blackwood cut him off gently. "Paper burns, medals get pawned. That doesn't matter." He looked over the lieutenant's shoulder at the company, who were forming up. The boys were standing straighter today. They were checking their breeches without being told. They were looking at the horizon with the hard, cynical eyes of veterans. "Look at them, sir," Blackwood pointed with his pipe stem. "Yesterday they were milksops. Today they're soldiers. You've got a regiment now. That's the only medal I need." Alastair fumbled in his pocket and pulled out a heavy gold sovereign, a fortune for a working man. He held it out. "Please, take it, for a drink on the way home." Blackwood looked at the coin, then up at the officer. He shook his head slowly. "Keep your money, my lord. You might need it to buy a better map." He laughed then, a rich, deep sound, and extended his hand. Alastair took it. The grip was rough, callous against the aristocrat's smooth skin. "Goodbye, Private," Alastair said. "Goodbye, Lieutenant. Keep your head down and aim low." Blackwood picked up his kit bag, slung it over his shoulder, and turned to walk towards the supply train that would take him back to the coast, back to the ships, and back to the grey fog of London. He walked with a slight limp, favoring his left leg, but his back was ramrod straight. Lord Alastair watched him go until he disappeared into the dust. Then the bugle sounded. The lieutenant turned back to his men. He took a deep breath, mimicking the cadence he had heard in the ravine. "Right, you bastards! Form up, eyes front!" The story of the 60-year-old recruit was never headline news. The Victorians preferred their heroes to be young, dashing, and preferably dead. General Gordon at Khartoum became the martyr. The boys of the squares became the stalwarts. Thomas Blackwood slipped through the cracks of history, a footnote in a dusty regimental ledger. He likely returned to London, to a small room in a pension, perhaps telling his story in a pub to men who didn't believe him, or perhaps keeping his silence, content in the knowledge of the thing itself. But his legacy remained in the desert. It remained in the survival of 80 men who went on to have families, to live lives, to grow old themselves. It remained in the tactical shift that slowly began to permeate the British Army, a grudging realization that technology could not replace tenacity, and that the old way of the volunteer professional was worth more than 1,000 conscripts. We look back at these wars now through the lens of history, seeing the maps and the movements of generals. But we must never forget that the empire was not built by the men on the horses, but by the men in the boots. Men like Thomas Blackwood, the silent, forgotten guardians who stood in the gap when the line broke, who treated war not as a glory, but as a job of work to be done. He was the ghost of the Alma, the savior of the Suakin, and the unknown soldier to whom we owe the debt of memory. As the dust settles on our story, let us leave him there, walking away into the heat haze, a singular figure of defiant courage, carrying the weight of the regiment on his tired old shoulders.